Hello. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about a response to the recent war in Israel because it's troubling for me, it's troubling for you probably, it's troubling for a lot of people. I just want to share a few thoughts in terms of part of how to cope with that. So stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So, in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about current events, which is not something I typically do on this channel, but I thought about doing this because of the recent events in Israel. And this is not a new type of stress. Unfortunately, wars have been going on and troubling community, national and global events have been going on as long as you and I have been alive and longer. But I thought about making this video partly because it's in the context of um, the channel and me thinking about just general ways to help people cope, but also as a therapist, you know, when these global events come up, people present in therapy struggling with them. So it's part of what we therapists end up doing, helping people cope with not only anxiety and depression that's very local within the individual, or interpersonal stress, let's say marital discord, marital strife. But we help people cope with life, including coping with stressors that primarily exist outside of the individual in the community and the wider spheres, all the way out to the global sphere. So, this is a very big topic. It's something actually that I've personally focused on even for many years before I became a therapist, because I'm someone that has um, tried to work with how these things affect me, and also to try to be a responsible citizen, to respond in an optimally supportive way to help support good outcomes for systemic issues and wider issues beyond just what's going on inside of my own head. But I'm not going to get into a lot of the fundamental arguments for how one generally should orient toward these things, or why. But it's certainly something that I've deeply explored, both as a therapist, as again an engaged citizen, and also as someone who historically in the past has been involved with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship and the Zen Peacemaker Order, and I've also led lots of workshops for activists and people involved in political activity in order to help people stay healthy and cope and be resilient in that role, right? But I thought about making this video in part because even though I personally throttle my watching the news pretty tightly as part of my own wellness program, when the recent events unfolded in Israel, I found that natural tendency to widen that filter and start to take in more, and that my cycle of taking in more information that way, expanded to the point where I was starting to absorb a lot of energy and have a lot of reactions. And shortly into that, noticed that as I have done in the past around these types of reactions, I needed to engage in self-care in order to not let the energy that's coming in from those events and the way that I'm aware of it negatively impact me. And I'm not just talking about trying to not be miserable about it, because if that were the only goal, then being apathetic or going and burying our heads in the sand would be the solution, right? But it's not the solution, because if we as individuals have a sense of responsibility to those beyond ourself, um, you can't bury your head in the sand fully, right? So there's that complex balancing act there, and it's not always so simple in terms of what to do about it. Also, it's true, just as it was true in 2020 when COVID blew up and patients were coming and talking about COVID, patients were talking about the war in Ukraine. Recently, patients are presenting with significant stress related to what's going on in Israel, in the Middle East more broadly. So I just want to make this video because you might be absorbing that type of energy, whether it's this particular set of events or political events, or politics in the United States is complex, and there's a lot of tension and similar sources of this type of energy too. So I wanted to make this video just to help you um, know about some strategies, some ways to think about how to deal with this, because it's something that's, it's come up with me again over the decades. It's come up with other patients, many patients over my career, and it's come up more recently. And so one of the things that I want you to consider is that, we're all connected in a complex web of interconnectedness. And I'm not getting too frou-frou and new agey here, but the reality is, if you're watching this video, you and I now have a connection. Even if you've never watched any of my other videos, the fact that you're watching this video that I produces a connection between you and me, right? You're connected to all the people in your life, right? You're connected in some way to all the people in your community, right? And if we zoom out, there are avenues, vectors of connection between each one of us and every other person alive, and all of the people who've lived in the past and the people in the future. You could think about it as somewhat analogous to a volleyball net, where each place where the strings cross is a knot, and each of those knots could represent one of us, and we're all connected to each other, right? So if something happens, if I push on one of the points where the strings cross, it's going to affect the surrounding ones, right? Now, a volleyball net is obviously too simplistic, because the actual ways that you and I and everybody are interconnected is much more complex than the relatively two-dimensional volleyball net, but you get the point, right? So the reality is that, when the war in Israel is happening, even if I have no personal connection to Israel or anyone in Gaza, the reality is I become connected when I become aware of it. I also become connected when my patients show up and they are bringing to the table their issues with how they're perceiving and reacting to what's going on, right? So again, apathy is not a choice, because then we are irresponsible. And so we have some connection, which means the troubling aspects of what have been occurring, what are occurring, what we imagine are going to occur in that situation affect us. We absorb it and we respond to it. That web of interconnectedness brings very complex energy to each one of us. And the reason I'm making this video is that part of coping is that each one of us has to try to figure out, how do we remain stable enough and not get overwhelmed, so that we're not too miserable, just from a selfish perspective, but B, and more deeply, that we can continue to function and we can continue to be responsible, not only to ourselves, but to others. Because if we cannot remain stable, we can't have a good reaction. We're going to have a suboptimal reaction if we get subsumed into rage or despair, powerlessness. We can't be helpful from that type of state. I think of a story that Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous meditation teacher, told one time. when he was working with an organization that was helping displaced boat people in Southeast Asia. So one time they were in Singapore and like 800 boat people arrived in the port from somewhere, maybe Myanmar or somewhere. And the Singaporean government said to the boat people, you've got 12 hours and you have to be out. So this organization that Thich Nhat Hanh was working with, they were going to try to help these boat people in some way. Otherwise, these people are going to be pushed out into international waters and, at great risk. So the interesting part of this story, and the reason I share it, is because what Thich Nhat Hanh reported about that event was that they convened a meeting to sit down and try to strategize what they could do to help these boat people. But Thich Nhat Hanh says before he went to the meeting, he decided he would do 20 minutes of walking meditation, right? So what he knew was that if he just rushed into the meeting, he might not show up as his better self. He might not be as capable to contribute constructively to whatever was going to go on in that meeting if he didn't center himself first. So I think this is something that can go out the window when something is deeply troubling. It sparks our stress reaction, which I've talked about in other videos. And when the stress reaction goes up, our brain naturally adopts a mode where we have a sense of urgency. And maybe there is true objective urgency. Certainly there is urgency in Israel to have a resolution to this conflict that is good for everybody. But, our sense of urgency can sometimes push us to react from a suboptimal state. And if our goal is to be constructively involved in supporting the best possible outcomes in our world, we're going to do that better if we show up in our better state. And if we get overwhelmed and we decompensate ourselves because of our troubled reaction that we're having in ourself, we cannot be as helpful as we might need to be and want to be. And so one bit of advice that I try to practice myself, and one bit of advice that I give to you, is regardless of the source, whether it's the thing in Israel, the war in Ukraine, politics in the United States, other sources of stress that's coming in from the global environment, the community, I want you to consider what are the ways that you can remain grounded. Because prior to this moment where you're watching this video with me, I am guessing that you have already explored things in your life, whether it's wellness activities, exercise, yoga, spiritual activities, prayer, meditation, good social support. There are things that each one of us, you and me, we already know today. You could sit down with a piece of paper if I gave you a homework assignment, and you could list what are the ways that I know that reliably work for me to help me feel grounded. You need to not let those go out the window. Those need to be in play, not only for you to stay stable enough to not be more miserable than you want to be, but also for you to be the person you need to be in order to be constructively involved in supporting good outcomes with the things that you choose to focus on and be involved with. You also have strengths. I do, you do. Those of us who want to support good outcomes for community issues and global issues, part of what we contribute is our perspective and our personal strengths. And our perspective gets skewed when we get all discombobulated, and we don't allow our strengths to come into play in as optimal a way as they could if we're knocked off our center. So this is another argument to find ways to try to find stability and some equanimity, even in the midst of the turbulence of troubling energies coming in from outside, however they are getting to you, whatever the vectors of all those intricate webs of interconnectedness are, these energies get to us. And part of what we need to do is not only get uber reactive in the moment, we may need to urgently respond to something in some moment in a focused way, but we need to do that as well as we can from a state of stability. And I know this is easier to say than it is often to do, but I truly believe this is a fundamental element of coping with these types of troubles. We need to find ways to access the strategies to be as stable as we can be, because that's going to help us cope personally as individuals, but it's also going to support a better response however you and I get involved in trying to support good outcomes with whatever the issues happen to be. So this is one piece of advice I wanted to throw out today is do what you can to take care of yourself. If that means taking a break from the news for a day or two, then that's what it is, right? It's better to be slightly uninformed than completely off your center and spinning out. But again, that's not the only strategy. And the purpose of this video is not to survey, the range of such strategies, but just to encourage you to consider, how can I be stable so that I can A, cope, and B, be responsible in the ways that I want to. So if you like this kind of content, hit the like button below. If you've yet to subscribe to my channel, please subscribe and stay tuned to the channel for future videos. And thanks for joining me today.